There was a time when 3 short words were on the lips of every British soldier.
Our job out here is basically looking after hearts and minds.
Which is all good for the hearts and minds process.
So what we're finding we're having to do is get into the hearts and minds of people within their own villages.
In 2003, American and British forces invaded Iraq and removed its dictator, Saddam Hussein. To meet the needs of the Iraqi population and win their support, the British came armed with a unique tactic they had devised and even coined a name for. It was called Hearts and Minds. To understand it, I spoke to one of the world's leading military strategists, the general who once headed up the British Army, the commander of British forces in Iraq and counterinsurgency mastermind, the colonel who ordered his men to respect the people, and the soldier who brought Hearts and Minds to its children, and ask, what is Hearts and Minds? How did it play out in Iraq? And what is its legacy today?
An understanding of hearts and minds and training in the concepts of hearts and minds is a really important part of the toolkit.
Once you realise that we were there to help them, I think they welcomed us.
But if you want to stabilise a place, if you want to make it somewhere that's fit to live, then you must have a hearts and minds strategy.
These jungles are where the story of Hearts and Minds begins. In the 1950s, the British Empire faced an ongoing insurgency against its rule in Malaya in Southeast Asia. To gain a winning advantage, the new British commander suggested something radical. His name was General Sir Gerald Templar. He said, the shooting side of this business is only 25% of the trouble, and the other 75% lies in getting the people of the country behind us. The answer lies not in pouring more troops into the jungle, but in the hearts and minds of the people. Templar, nicknamed the Smiling Tiger, combined military force with a stronger emphasis on winning the hearts and minds of the civilians. It was a fight for their support. In a nutshell, it's the birth of British counterinsurgency.
When we talk about hearts and minds, what we're basically saying is we want to do and say things and take actions that persuade the minds and therefore the hearts of the target people in whose country we're operating to want to follow what we're doing. Hearts and minds really means trying to influence people to do what we want them to do in the best interests of countering what the insurgents want.
You give people confidence that they're with the winners, and that as victory comes, so will their standard of life improve. There'll be better schools, hospitals.
The trick is to look at both the words, heart and mind. The reality is battle, war, in its ugliest sense and even in its more, sort of contemporary sense, is a battle of wills. So the mind is about will. You have to almost have a sort of out-of-body experience, not quite but where you look from where they are at you and their circumstances and perspective. And that gives you an understanding of their heart.
Although Hearts and Minds never became taught doctrine, it was adopted by Britain's armed forces and implemented in conflict zones such as Kosovo and Sierra Leone. And in 2003, it will take centre stage. 9/11. Al-Qaeda terrorists attack the United States. Its leader, Osama bin Laden, evades capture in Afghanistan. The US and its British ally turn their focus on Iraq and its dictator Saddam Hussein, who they accuse of harbouring weapons of mass destruction. A coalition invasion assembles in Kuwait. Lieutenant Colonel Tim Collins commanded the 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment and gave a rousing eve of battle speech to his soldiers. He said, "We go to liberate, not to conquer. And you will have to go a long way to find a more decent, generous and upright people than the Iraqis. don't treat them as refugees, for they are in their own country.
Well, because our mission, as I understood it, was we were literally liberating them as opposed to conquering them. So the Iraqi people were not our enemy per se. Saddam's regime were the enemy. We were going to liberate them from the oppression of Saddam's regime. So it naturally follows that people who you're going to liberate, you don't want to treat as hostile. I think the understanding was that we were quickly going to try and establish some form of stability in Iraq so that we could, as quickly as possible, normalize relations.
And in March 2003, the war begins. Allied forces quickly prevail. Saddam is deposed and later captured, and the British take responsibility for Basra, a city in southern Iraq of over 1 million people. There is little violence, and British troops are welcomed. To appear less threatening, they swap their helmets for berets when they can. They also set about restoring law and order, and essential services such as electricity, water, and medicine.
What's your name?
What's your name?
Shane? David Beckham?
The boss. Thank you.
As we've always known, that the more friendly and approachable you become, the more likely you are to keep the civilian population on side.
The counterinsurgency campaign is always going to be about the people. I mean, that's why war, in any sense, is a human activity. It's amongst the people.
Okay. And I'll try and have an answer for you.
We need help from you.
Yes, that's fine. We will try and give you help.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Okay, then see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Okay, yes.
Well, I think that they were relieved that this had happened, and I think people were expecting that they would be liberated, and but as well as that expectation and welcome, they had many needs as well, and those were the complications that started to pan out quite early on. And again, it was evident that the coalition, and certainly the British system, hadn't really thought about what they were going to do. They didn't know what to expect, and they hadn't prepared for the expectation. And so we were really having to think on our feet. And I was greatly assisted in doing that by a number of Iraqis that I was able to quickly recruit as advisors, and they were able to tell us what needed to be done.
12 Regiment Royal Artillery was tasked with air defence, but with the Iraqi Air Force destroyed, it was reassigned to a Hearts and Minds role, and Darren Madden's battery visited a local school.
And there's Great Britain. Okay?
Yes.
All that way.
If you didn't have the hearts and minds and making friends with people, you'll go in as an occupying force. You know, if you go in with an open mind, playing the hearts and minds card and making friends, befriending villages, you're not occupying, you're assisting. You know, I think that's the way I look at it. I think it's probably the best way to go about things, really, because that way then you've got natural intelligence on the ground. Because if something's happening, if you've befriended the locals, they won't be afraid of saying, oh, something's going on up there, or someone's saying this, someone's doing this, or whatever. You know, so if you've got that natural intelligence on the ground, and you'll only get that from being nice to people and being friendly.
There'll be loads and loads of unexploded bombs and everything else that look like this.
It wasn't the most dangerous area where they were living, but it was relatively dangerous, so there was quite a lot of unexploded munitions and what have you, so I think we were just trying to educate them to stay away and stay safe. Initially, they were probably a little bit suspect, because, you know, you've got strangers, foreigners coming in with guns and weapons and everything else, so it could be a bit daunting for them. But once they realised the reasons we were there to help them get water, help them with food, help them with medical services, you know, we had teams of medics with us, you know, so we could take medics round. Once they realised that we were there to help them, you know, I think they welcomed us.
With no major plan for post-war reconstruction, British soldiers have to provide humanitarian aid, as well as essential development. Modern soldiers are required to simultaneously fight, peacekeep, and offer humanitarian aid, often within the same small area. It has become central to what they do and who they are.
Actually, the truth is, hearts and minds, or that sense of will, reason why, actually underpins everything I ever did in uniform. My favourite line in any poem is Ulysses, which merely says, I am a part of all that I have met. We are the sum of all my experiences, good, bad, and thoroughly ugly. And so the truth about it is, we need to be human. We need to have that humanity. We need to have that sense of to try and make things better.
Timing is crucial to a successful hearts and minds operation. For the moment, the population offer emotional support, but their rational self-interest also asks, how long will the occupiers stay, and will they be the winning side?
We've got to be able to quickly provide them with the resources that they need, like electricity and water, else otherwise they're just going to not have any confidence in us, and quite quickly they'll probably turn against us.
Timing in hearts and minds is a bit like penicillin. When you have an illness, you take your penicillin and it kills off the infection, but you got to finish your course of penicillin in order to kill it so it won't come back. If you stop halfway through, the illness comes back, and it comes back resistant to penicillin, and then you've got a real problem. Hearts and minds are the same. When you go in initially, you got to grip it, and you got to stay and grip it until the problem has gone away, and that's quite a long time. And then you allow other elements to come in and fill the vacuum, which you're then managing. If you stop halfway through, withdraw to barracks, you have no control of what's happening.
There's a well-recorded story of a elderly sheikh in Basra saying to the commanding officer of one of our battle groups, this is the third time in my life that I've welcomed the British to my city, but if you stay too long, we will shoot at you. Now that was really very interesting. It meant that we actually had a period of time that we could influence the people for the better, but if we stayed too long, there was always the risk that our presence would become part of the problem.
In May 2003, Paul Bremer, the American de facto ruler of Iraq, disbands the Iraqi army and sacks former members of the regime from their jobs. And the British reduce their invasion force in Basra. There is increased looting, and crime and hostility grows, and insurgency takes root.
Robbers!
They took your
They
car.
just take my car over here.
What car was it?
It was black Suburban, 99. Just about 10 minutes ago.
20 or 1 Alpha.
So
This
what
is,
you gonna do?
23
Just they
Alpha.
take it this way.
Just hold on 2 minutes.
Actually, the country is their responsibility, the security is their responsibility. We cannot blame anybody, we just blame the coalition forces.
We've got another factor which affects counterinsurgency, which is often called search and destroy. That is, you've got people setting at ambushes and taking pot shots and detonating bombs, and you've got to root them out. And the process of rooting them out means that you've got to find them and then kill them or capture them. And of course that process can go against hearts and minds.
There are other people who we call insurgents who take a different view to ourselves, different view to the government forces, different view to the security forces, and they will try and use violence against us. So there are times when we have to use violence against them. But the important thing is to use our violence in such a way that it does not negatively influence the people whose hearts and minds you're trying to influence your way.
With growing violence, counterinsurgency can pull in two opposite directions. Should the focus be on fighting the enemy or persuading the people? General Templer argued the emphasis should be on hearts and minds. But what if the balance changes? And what if soldiers lose their humanity? In 2003, American soldiers abuse and torture Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib, and an Iraqi man, Baha Musa, is beaten to death in British Army custody.
And the Baha Musa incident is a real black mark on the British Army in Basra. Frankly, it should never have happened. That man should not have been held in the custody of the unit that had held him. He certainly shouldn't have inflicted blows upon his body, 92 blows upon his body, such that he eventually died in our custody. Once word got out about that, that was hugely negative as far as any Hearts and Minds campaign is concerned.
What happened to Baha Musa is hard to explain, and that I find it difficult to understand how it could be, but it did happen with a British unit, that could ever have happened. Abu Ghraib was, again, the chaos theory that they were having pulled the fabric which holds Iraqi society apart. They were fighting with the Iraqis. And the irony of that is that there was the actions of a very few, but the damage was huge.
The freedom which will you give us from America and British, there is no good freedom to us. Because there is no job for me, no salary for me. What we shall do? We should fight or not?
Over the next few years, the British struggled to stabilise Basra and its regions. It lacks resources, and its troop numbers are reduced further as Britain grows its military presence in Afghanistan. Local militias grow in power and violence becomes endemic. Soldiers can no longer patrol in their berets. Eventually the British garrison will withdraw from Basra for the relative safety of its airport. And by 2009, Britain withdraws completely. Does this mean Hearts and Minds failed? Or were other factors at play?
We were trying to control a very large city with a relatively small number of soldiers. So the ability to form relationships, to get to know an area, to get to know the local leaders in an area, to be able to sit down and discuss local issues with them, really became extremely difficult because we were stretched too thin. And the success of Hearts and Minds is often based when a unit that's in a particular locality for maybe a shorter 6 months, but sometimes in some campaigns it's been for longer, get to know the local tribal leaders, get to know the local elders, and you build up a relationship, and when there are issues and when there are problems, you can talk about them. In Basra, there were too many of them and too few of us to build up those kind of relationships.
By essentially doing nothing, they left the door open for increasingly emboldened indigenous groups forming themselves in the militia, and they basically took over the towns and displaced the British Army to the point the British Army were living in small bastions within towns and pushed out to camps on the outside. The bad guys ran the towns, the British were basically spectators, and eventually pushed out of the Basra province with their tail between their legs.
Part of it is convincing local people that you're the ones to back, which is not only what you can do for them, but that you're going to be there, that you're going to stay. And the issue is evidence that it didn't want to hang around, wanted to get home, which is fine if you're handing over to a stable and efficient government, but not so fine if it's all pretty fragile.
And the whole campaign was much, much longer than it should have been. And you get back to that point that I mentioned earlier. Welcome to my city, but if you stay too long, we will shoot at you. We stayed in the end far too long with far too small a body of troops. Their attitude towards us was radicalised negatively, and the whole thing spiralled down.
Britain's failure in Iraq has led to questions about its counterinsurgency strategy and its very British tactic of Hearts and Minds. Some have questioned if it was clever marketing to disguise brutal force. Those who were there answer passionately against.
Oh, that's so wrong. If it's about a battle of wills, then of course Hearts and Minds have a part to play. And the idea that you suggest that it's merely a PR and that people like me, in fact, have no interest, totally no humanity in dealing with, in fact, the detritus and the aftermath of us having bombed or hit or gone into a village or whatever the case may be, or picking up the debris from where someone else has gone through and just murdered everyone, would be just rude. I believe it is in fact in the inherent DNA of everyone who served, is serving, and hopefully will serve in our armed forces.
The need to engage and understand the societies in which military operations takes place is fundamental. Hearts and Minds has influenced that approach. Today, the British Army's cadets are taught the importance of population-centric counterinsurgency.
There's two ways of winning a war. You can either fight it with bullets and bombs and missiles and everything else, or you can, I wouldn't say the soft approach, but you can do the psychological approach and the nice, friendly approach and achieve the same thing without, obviously, massive loss of life.
But if you want to stabilise a place, if you want to make it somewhere that's fit to live and eventually somewhere that you will have good relations with in the future, then you must have a hearts and minds strategy. You've got to think about it and got to thinking of the phases and how you're going to implement it, and also make available the resources you need in order to, and have that as part of the initial planning process.
If we end up intervening in another country and supporting a government that's under threat, then you don't want to do things that put it more under threat, that make the local population more unhappy, more angry, more alienated. And all the things you do to avoid that you can call hearts and minds. But it is only one component of intervention, it's not the whole thing.
The target of the insurgency are the people, and the target of our Hearts and Minds campaign is to influence the people to support the government and do what we want them to do. So using a Hearts and Minds campaign will always be a key element of a counterinsurgency campaign.